The Battle of Red Cliff stands as one of the most significant naval confrontations in history, involving hundreds of thousands in a fierce conflict. Chinese warlord Cao Cao, eager to gain numerical superiority over his adversaries, recruits infantry and cavalry to serve as sailors. However, this strategic decision does not yield the anticipated results. The tumultuous sea induces widespread seasickness, with inexperienced sailors succumbing to the motion and vomiting overboard. Nevertheless, Cao Cao remains resolute in his strategy. He binds his fleets together in an attempt to stabilize them. This action, however, transforms his vessels into easy targets, allowing his opponents to set the entire fleet ablaze, thereby converting his ambitious plan into a catastrophic failure. Such a blunder in warfare is indeed remarkable. Yet the narrative of military missteps is far from over, as we delve into today's episode of the History Empire Center Show, highlighting the dumbest war mistakes ever made. 11. Making promises you cannot fulfill. The First World War inflicted a staggering toll on France, with approximately 1.4 million casualties. The enormity of this loss weighed heavily on the nation. Thus, when French Commander-in-Chief Robert Nivelle assured his troops of a bold strategy in the spring of 1917, it must have seemed like a glimmer of hope was emerging. Nivelle proclaimed that the French forces would either achieve a rapid breakthrough at Chemin des Dames or execute a swift withdrawal within 2 days if circumstances turned unfavorable. This was a commitment. It is well known that the French have a penchant for dramatic exits. The French forces commenced their offensive at Chemin des Dames, convinced that the battle would conclude decisively within a mere 2 days. However, as hours stretched into days, the situation began to deteriorate. For a French soldier, the anticipation of a withdrawal order must have been palpable. Surely it would arrive. Nivelle had promised it. Yet there was silence. No orders, no retreat, only the stark realization that Nivelle had abandoned them. History teaches us that failing to uphold promises is ill-received in France. Nivelle seemed to have overlooked the fate of Louis XIV and his encounter with the guillotine in 1793. Nivelle was fortunate that his punishment was not as severe as it could have been. Instead, he encountered a mutiny among his ranks, with approximately half of his soldiers declaring that they were no longer willing to engage in offensive actions, although they would still defend their positions. A single broken promise jeopardized the entire nation. During the spring of 1917, Germany remained unaware of the unrest brewing within the French forces. Had they been informed, they might have taken advantage of the situation to launch a counteroffensive. However, this did not occur, and France managed to secure portions of Chaumont-les-Dames. Nevertheless, the significant victory that Nivelle had assured never materialized. France promptly replaced the beleaguered commander-in-chief with Philippe Pétain, who provided a more stable leadership. Nivelle's legacy, in contrast, is not particularly commendable. Some historians regard him as a poor choice for command, while others have largely forgotten him. At least the French mutineers were receiving their pay, which is more than can be said for the next unfortunate military blunder. In 1667, it is difficult to envision maintaining loyalty to a leader who compensates you solely with promises. Yet this was the expectation of King Charles II of England from his sailors, even as the Dutch fleet advanced up the Thames. To say that Charles II lacked financial acumen would be a significant understatement. In a clandestine agreement with Louis XIV of France, he committed to converting to Catholicism in exchange for a substantial sum. While the money began to flow in, rather than allocating it to support the soldiers he had promised for France's conflict with the Dutch, Charles indulged himself. After all, why focus on winning a war when one can prioritize personal embellishments? Consequently, when the Dutch fleet reached the Thames and approached the Medway, where the English ships were stationed, Charles' sailors did not rush to engage. As cannon fire rained down on the British vessels, many sailors were conspicuously absent, and those who did arrive were not particularly eager to board their imperiled ships. After enduring months of compensation in the form of "I owe us," the morale among the sailors was notably low. Promissory notes do not provide sustenance, and the English sailors reached their breaking point. In a turn of events reminiscent of a dramatic series, some even defected, aligning themselves with the Dutch in pursuit of actual remuneration. 3 of England's 4 principal ships were sunk. The Royal Charles was captured by the Dutch, leading to one of the British Navy's most significant humiliations. Winston Churchill, who was serving as the First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, had already encountered the formidable nature of Gallipoli. He had previously attempted to navigate an aging fleet of 18 British warships through the Dardanelles in an effort to reach Constantinople, now known as Istanbul. The fortifications along the Gallipoli Peninsula forced his fleet to retreat, resulting in the sinking of 5 vessels. If this experience was not a sufficient warning, Greece's recommendation for a force of 150,000 soldiers should have been. However, Britain's Secretary of State, Lord Herbert Kitchener, dismissed these concerns as mere exaggeration. He believed that the Turks would retreat at the mere sight of Allied troops and assigned General Sir Ian Hamilton the task of orchestrating an amphibious assault on the Gallipoli Peninsula. It is a hallmark of military strategy to base an entire operation on unfounded optimism. While reaching the shores of Gallipoli presented no significant challenges, as British soldiers disembarked from small lifeboats with relative ease, the true difficulties began upon their arrival on land. Turkish machine guns opened fire, decimating the advancing forces. Of the first 200 soldiers to land, only 21 managed to reach the beach. The remaining troops were swiftly overwhelmed, yet this alarming sign was overlooked. The British forces, along with their Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC allies, continued their advance. Approximately 2,000 British soldiers landed at a location known as Y Beach, which appeared to be undefended and secure. Lacking communication from General Hamilton, who was stationed far offshore on the HMS Queen Elizabeth and unable to observe the battle or issue commands, the troops made the best of their situation. They took cover and, in quintessential British fashion, enjoyed a few cups of tea amidst the distant sounds of gunfire. Hamilton was remarkably unaware of the catastrophe unfolding around him, even assuring Lord Kitchener that, due to favorable weather and the commendable morale of our troops, everything was proceeding smoothly. In reality, the situation was dire and deteriorating rapidly. The subsequent 8 months were marked by relentless trench warfare, ultimately resulting in the withdrawal of Allied forces. The standoff claimed the lives of 500,000 men, a tragedy that could have been averted had the 2,000 soldiers stationed at Y Beach received orders to flank the machine guns positioned on the high ground, which were decimating the Anzac troops. Next, we turn to another military force that was overly confident in its numerical superiority: the French army during the Battle of Agincourt. History has shown the perils of overestimating one's advantages in numbers, as evidenced by Rome's catastrophic defeat at the hands of Hannibal. However, the French forces engaged in the 100 Years' War seemed oblivious to this lesson. After a millennium, the tendency toward overconfidence remained unchanged. With a numerical advantage of up to 5-1, the French fielded between 20,000 and 30,000 soldiers against a mere 6,000 English troops. Victory appeared assured. All that was required was a charge, and their superior numbers would secure the win. However, they failed to account for a critical factor: the English longbow. This oversight marked the beginning of France's miscalculations. The French underestimated the longbow's accuracy, rate of fire, and effective range. They believed they could simply charge through a barrage of arrows, confident that their numbers would enable them to overpower the English forces. The charge might have been successful had it not been for additional French errors. The battlefield had become a quagmire after weeks of rain, hindering the French troops' advance. As they struggled through the mud, English archers capitalized on the situation, raining arrows down upon the immobilized soldiers and horses. For those cavalry units that did manage to break through, the challenges continued. The English encountered yet another unwelcome surprise: sharpened wooden stakes meticulously positioned to halt charging horses abruptly. Riders who managed to evade this obstacle found themselves dismounted and confronted by the pointed ends of England's infantry. Following the cavalry, France's infantry joined the fray, but the situation did not improve. They became tightly packed, akin to sardines, rendering them unable to wield their weapons effectively. By the time they advanced past England's archers, they were so severely diminished that they stood little chance. France suffered approximately 6,000 casualties, including numerous nobles, while England's losses were around 400. A multitude of French soldiers fled the battlefield. These missteps granted England a significant advantage. allowing them to seize Normandy and ultimately compelling France to accept the humiliating Treaty of Troyes. Nevertheless, despite France's numerous errors, its soldiers did not turn against one another, a fate that nearly befell them when the United States placed its own president in jeopardy. Number 6. Attempting to assassinate Franklin D. Roosevelt. Adolf Hitler and his Axis allies would have done anything to eliminate U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt during World War II, yet they never came close. Ironically, the U.S. nearly accomplished this task themselves. The narrative begins in July 1943 with the commissioning of the USS William D. Porter, affectionately known as the Willie D. This brand new $6 million vessel, manned by an inexperienced crew, found itself assigned to a prestigious mission, escorting the USS Iowa to the Tehran Conference. On board the USS Iowa were President Franklin D. Roosevelt, U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and leading military officials. Their destination was a critical meeting with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill at the Tehran Conference. The Willie D quickly established itself as the clumsy companion in a real-life series of blunders. The errors began to manifest even before the vessels departed. During a standard maneuver at the harbor, the inexperience of the Willie D resulted in an immediate incident. While attempting to reverse alongside another ship, it collided with the other vessel's anchor, causing railings to be torn off and lifeboats to plunge into the water. Remarkably, the Willie D itself sustained no damage, but it left behind a scene of disarray and bewildered sailors. This was merely a precursor to the troubles that lay ahead. As the Willie D embarked on its voyage to Algeria, it inadvertently initiated a series of mishaps, not against the enemy, but within its own convoy. During a training drill, the inexperienced crew accidentally released a live depth charge overboard, leading to an explosion that reverberated throughout the entire convoy, prompting all ships to engage in frantic anti-submarine maneuvers. It was only after the crew managed to communicate that it was not a German assault, but rather a failure to secure the depth charge, that calm was restored. The blunders continued to escalate. At one juncture during the voyage, President Roosevelt sought to evaluate the fleet's aerial defenses. The USS Iowa deployed a series of balloons, providing the surrounding ships an opportunity to practice their targeting skills. The crew aboard the Willie D enthusiastically participated, with sailors rushing to the lower decks to simulate torpedo launches aimed at the Iowa. Then, an alarming incident occurred. The Willie D inadvertently discharged a torpedo while its primer was still intact. A live torpedo hurtled toward the USS Iowa, the vessel carrying the President of the United States. Fortunately, the crew of the Willie D seemingly bypassed the fundamentals of aiming and, remarkably, managed to completely miss the enormous American battleship. Lawton Dawson, the torpedo operator aboard the Willie D, acknowledged his error and was sentenced to 14 years of hard labor. However, President Roosevelt later commuted the sentence. At least it is worth noting that this incident of friendly fire did not result in any casualties, which cannot be said for the subsequent military misstep. Number 5. Friendly fire at the Battle of Karansevich. One should never provoke soldiers eager for combat by allowing them to indulge in alcohol. While a little Dutch courage may bolster morale on the battlefield, it can quickly escalate into a chaotic bar fight among troops, leading to disastrous consequences. This scenario unfolded in 1788 during the Battle of Karansevich. In the second year of the Austro-Turkish War, Austria dispatched scouts across the Danube River under the cover of darkness. Their objective was straightforward: to gather intelligence on the positions of the Ottoman Empire. Instead, the scouts encountered a group of Saigon, Romani individuals from Eastern Europe who presented an intriguing offer: barrels of schnapps for sale. The scouts, forgetting their mission, eagerly accepted the offer. They soon became inebriated, and shortly thereafter, some Austrian infantrymen discovered the scouts in their inebriated state, not out of concern for the failed reconnaissance, but rather because they too desired to partake in the schnapps. When the scouts declined to comply, a confrontation erupted. The situation deteriorated rapidly. A gunshot rang out, and amidst the drunken chaos, the inebriated soldiers turned their weapons on one another. To exacerbate the disorder, a soldier, likely one of the more intoxicated, shouted, "Turks! Turks!" This incited widespread panic. The scouts and infantrymen hastily retreated to their camps, only to discover that they had ignited a full-scale turmoil in the darkness. The Austrian army was a diverse assembly of soldiers from various European nations, including Germans, Austrians, Italians, Czechs, Croats, and others, many of whom could not communicate effectively. Consequently, when they were commanded to stop, most soldiers were left bewildered, continuing to engage in combat with their fellow troops. The situation worsened when an Austrian corps commander misinterpreted the chaos in the camp as a Turkish cavalry assault. He ordered his men to bombard the camp with artillery, resulting in the deaths of hundreds during the fray. Ultimately, a group of intoxicated Austrian scouts ignited a catastrophic battle that resulted in the loss of over 10,000 lives, none of whom were Turkish. By the time Austria recognized that it had spent the night battling itself, its forces in Karnasievs were nearly annihilated. When Turkish soldiers arrived a few days later, they encountered minimal resistance, and the city virtually surrendered to them. The lesson to be learned is that alcohol and warfare are a perilous combination, a truth that the English had understood over a century prior to the Austrian camp conflict. In 1625, the English were buoyed by their past triumphs. Just under 4 decades earlier, they had decisively defeated the formidable Spanish Armada, resulting in the deaths of 15,000 Spanish soldiers and tarnishing Spain's status as the preeminent naval power. It seemed an opportune moment to reclaim their former glory with a raid on Spain. The port city of Cadiz was selected as the target, and the English set sail with a force of 10,000 men under the command of Sir Edward Cecil. The term force is often used, yet it is important to recognize that many individuals who undertook the journey were, in fact, criminals, with approximately 10% considered unfit for service due to health issues or age. Nevertheless, the soldiers successfully landed and even managed to capture the fort of Puntal. It is worth noting that the fort sustained minimal damage from the 2,000 rounds fired by the British ships. The real effort was exerted by the soldiers on the ground. However, a victory is still a victory. When Cecil believed he detected an advancing Spanish army, he promptly led his troops across the island of Leon, a vast area of saline marshes, to intercept them. After enduring the arduous journey, his motley crew of soldiers was left parched. While the troops set up camp, Cecil stumbled upon a nearby structure filled with wine. In a bid to satisfy his soldiers' thirst and boost their spirits, he opened the barrels, allowing his men to indulge freely. This decision proved to be a significant error. The English forces quickly consumed the barrels on empty stomachs, descending into chaos akin to rowdy soccer fans on a budget holiday in Spain. They engaged in riots, clashed with their commanding officers, and even turned against one another in drunken altercations. Witnessing the disarray of his forces, Cecil ordered a retreat the following day, leaving behind 100 soldiers who were too inebriated to stand. Along with heaps of equipment, his troops were too hungover to carry back to the ships. It bears repeating, do not drink while on duty. Unfortunately for Cecil, matters worsened. Once his men were back on their ships, he might have contemplated launching another assault on the Spanish fleet. However, that was not feasible. Spain had repositioned its vessels into an inlet, establishing a blockade that left England's hungover sailors with no viable chance of winning a direct confrontation. Ultimately, Cecil had no option but to abandon the mission and return home. The outcome of his endeavor was a complete failure. To compound his troubles, a plague broke out among his men. In a further miscalculation, Cecil sent the few healthy soldiers he had left to the plague-infested ships in exchange for the sick. He aspired to at least maintain the crew on the vessels so they could continue their voyage. Unfortunately, he inadvertently spread the disease throughout the entire force, culminating in a tragic and calamitous conclusion to a disastrous campaign. At this point, one has witnessed a notable blend of England's military missteps alongside moments of redemption. This trend is set to continue as we delve into the most renowned British military era. Number 3. The Charge of the Light Brigade. This event is etched in British military history as both a monumental mistake and an act of bravery that bordered on insanity. All evaluations of this incident hold merit, and it is particularly disheartening for England that it began with promise. In the initial phases of the 1854 Battle of Balaclava, British forces successfully repelled Russian cavalry. In fact, the Heavy Brigade of Britain had even compelled a retreat, paving the way for what should have been a significant victory. However, a complication arose. British Army Commander Lord Raglan harbored a persistent worry regarding the heavy artillery that his troops had left behind in the Causeway Heights area of the battlefield. He feared that the retreating Russians might capture those guns and use them against British forces. This concern was indeed valid. Allowing a retreating adversary to seize one's weaponry was unwise. Consequently, Raglan dispatched Captain Louis Edward Nolan of the 15th Light Dragoons to convey the order to reclaim the artillery to Lord Lucan, who was in command of the British Cavalry Division. However, a complication emerged. Nolan was not entirely clear about which artillery pieces Lucan was meant to target. When Lucan sought clarification, Nolan merely gestured broadly and stated, "There, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns." The issue arose when Nolan's expansive gesture indicated the area between the Causeway Heights and the Finucane Heights, which would later be referred to as the Valley of Death. If Lucan were to foolishly order his cavalry to charge into this valley, they would be subjected to fire from both sides as well as the front. Did Lucan seek clarification on this matter? Naturally, he did not. Presuming that Raglan had commanded his cavalry to seize the Russian artillery positioned in the valley, Lucan conveyed these orders to Lord Cardigan, the commander of the Light Brigade. Consequently, the British forces were poised to attack the incorrect target, and nothing could deter them. The 670 members of the Light Brigade assembled, prepared for engagement. Upon Cardigan's command, they began their advance, initially at a measured trot, which quickly escalated to a full gallop, heading directly into the Valley of Death. The Russian forces were astonished by the sight before them. Britain had sent cavalry armed with sabers into a confrontation against artillery. Remarkably, a portion of the Light Brigade managed to traverse half a mile of unrelenting artillery fire and reach the Russian gun positions. However, they were met with a horse-mounted artillery and cavalry contingent that was 3 times their number. With sabers drawn and poised for action, the surviving soldiers soon recognized the futility of capturing the artillery. With no viable alternative, they turned and charged back up the valley, striving to escape to safety. This reckless charge resulted in the deaths of 113 soldiers and injuries to 143 others. Additionally, Britain suffered the loss of hundreds of horses, all for an assault that had no prospect of success. Nevertheless, this entire debacle was immortalized in a poem by Alfred Tennyson, providing some measure of remembrance. It is worth noting that the charge of the Light Brigade is not the only ill-fated assault stemming from a grave military error. 2. The Battle of Little Bighorn represents a sequence of unfortunate blunders that have been etched into history for all the wrong reasons. Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, the architect of numerous errors, has been celebrated as an American hero for his renowned last stand at the Battle of Little Bighorn. This final confrontation was a result of his own decisions. Following the refusal of Sioux Chief Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse to accept peace with U.S. forces in 1868, General Philip Sheridan was assigned the task of addressing the so-called Native American issue. Sheridan collaborated with Generals Alfred Terry and John Gibbon to formulate a strategy. Gibbon was to advance up the Little Bighorn River, while Custer would maneuver around the Wolf Mountains, executing a classic pincer movement against the Sioux encampment. However, Custer repeatedly faltered throughout the operation. Eager for recognition, he disregarded the established plan and launched an assault on the Sioux camp prematurely, failing to wait for Gibbon to position his troops. Compounding the situation, Custer led his men through the Wolf Mountains rather than around them, exhausting his forces before the engagement even commenced. Custer's miscalculations continued. He underestimated the size of the opposition, as the Sioux had formed alliances with Arapaho and Cheyenne warriors, creating a combined force of 3,000 armed with Winchester rifles. In stark contrast, Custer commanded only 600 soldiers, placing him at a disadvantage of 5-1. To exacerbate matters, he adhered to conventional U.S. military tactics by splitting his already outnumbered contingent into 3 separate groups. This was a perilous decision under any circumstances, but it proved catastrophic when confronting 3,000 adversaries and initiating the attack far ahead of schedule. Custer's hubris also contributed to his downfall. He mistakenly anticipated that his adversaries would flee at the sight of his forces, grossly underestimating the resolve and determination of his opponents. The Sioux were resolute in their intention to regard the Battle of Little Bighorn as their final stand. Concurrently, Custer harbored political aspirations, envisioning a future presidential run. He perceived this confrontation as a chance to achieve a resounding victory over the Sioux, a personal accomplishment that would enhance his political credentials far more than if he were to share the accolades with other American forces. The outcome is a well-documented chapter in American history. The 210 soldiers under Custer's command were annihilated within a span of 2 hours. The sole survivor from his contingent was a horse named Comanche, who subsequently spent his life participating in parades for the 7th Cavalry. Despite Custer's numerous errors, he at least made an effort to prepare for the battle, a contrast to our previous miscalculation. 1. Santa Anna's fatal oversight. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna fancied himself the Napoleon of the West, a belief bolstered by his Mexican army's significant victories over Texas at Goliad and the Alamo. These triumphs instilled in him a sense of confidence that his conflicts with the independence-seeking Texans were nearing conclusion. He was convinced that Texas would remain an integral part of Mexico under his command. His initial blunder was the execution of 342 Texans captured at Goliad, an act that galvanized Texas like never before. Citizens from all walks of life, including the peace-loving populace and the ethnic Mexican Tijanos, united in their calls for Santa Anna's demise. Subsequently, Santa Anna made a critical error in selecting his campsite while preparing to confront General Samuel Houston's motley crew of soldiers. He chose to establish his camp on the San Jacinto Prairie, a marshy and wooded area that was unfamiliar to his troops, but well known to the Texans he was about to engage. Nevertheless, these missteps did not seal Santa Anna's fate. Upon Houston's arrival with a contingent of 1,300 troops, the 700 Mexican soldiers found themselves at a disadvantage, despite reinforcements being en route. With 1,200 troops under his command, Santa Anna awaited Texas's next action. By noon on April 20th, 1836, no such action had occurred, prompting Santa Anna to issue a rather questionable order, a period of rest. Not only did he call for rest, but he also chose to sleep without assigning any guards to his camp. The outcome of this decision was predictable. The Texans launched their attack at 4:30 p.m. The result was devastating for the Mexican forces, with approximately 650 soldiers perishing, while only 11 Texans lost their lives. Although Santa Anna managed to awaken amidst the turmoil, it was far too late for him to regain control. He was ultimately captured, marking Texas's first significant victory over Mexico. What do you consider the most egregious mistake in warfare from our list? Please share your thoughts in the comments section.